Good afternoon, and thanks for coming along with us in this cycle. The words we still don't have around the exhibition we have around feminisms. I'm going to switch into Spanish because Carolina speaks a marvelous Spanish, so we'll have an easier communication. It is an honor and a privilege to receive Carolin Emcke in CCCB. She visited us last year to speak about her book about hate. And when we organized this cycle on feminisms, we absolutely wanted to hear from her again. So thank you very much for your availability and for your generosity. It's amazing to count on your collaboration. If you don't know Carolin, she's a philosopher. She's a disciple of Axel Honneth and the best Frankfurt tradition. She has an amazing academic experience combined with a commitment on the ground. She's been a war journalist in Iraq and Gaza and the Gaza Strip, and she's also a writer in several European journals. She is also committed with activism for human rights and for and minorities and LGBTIQ plus minorities, and her commitment is a long-standing commitment with and towards culture. She says that civil resistance against hate is based and has to be based on culture and the development of new imaginaries. So from this perspective, she works in cultural programming in Berlin, in a theater in Berlin, where she programs several activities. And this is the work she's also carrying out in a house called the House of Cultures of Berlin. She's working on the ground with refugees who live in Berlin. Carolin has been awarded with important distinctions, such as the Peace Award offered by German librarians, and she has published a book against hate, Modos del Deseo in Spanish. So it's precisely in this intersection for a culture against hate, in the promotion of a open and plural society, and the intersection with gender. Well, she will focus on this topic. She will focus on the intersection between power, freedom, liberty. So Carolin, the floor is yours, and see you later.
Muchas gracias. Lo siento mucho que no puedo hablar catalán. Hablo castellano un poco y entiendo bastante bien, pero la charla va a ser en inglés. Muchas gracias a Adria Frank.
So thank you very much to Adria, who is going to be the interpreter. And thank you very much to all of you for being here. I know that there are many important topics and conflicts going on in Barcelona these days. So thank you very much for being here, despite all that's going on.
Present to you something that is a little bit different from what I used to do. It's not a classic lecture. It's not a classic or typical philosophical argument, but I'm very much concerned with the question of how to really interfere in the public sphere and how to really disrupt ideologies and ideological practices of domination, injustice, and violence. And so, for me, the most radical way of thinking about the Me Too questions, of thinking about sexism, of thinking about heteronormativity, of thinking about power and inequality was to develop a discourse that's very fragmented, that has parts and sections that are storytelling, that are very subjective, that are very personal, very intimate, and it has sections that are more political speech, and it has sections that are more analytical. And we might, in the discussion later on, talk about why I think that is relevant to have different genres of speaking also. But what I will do today in my talk is I will give you 3 different kinds of speaking, 3 different kinds of analysis, 3 different kinds of thinking about certain questions relating to silence, emancipation, or the body and violence. Can you hear me well? Is the speed okay? ¿Está bien? Okay. The first is under what I call imagination and complicity. I didn't see the actual blow. The blow with which the husband punished his wife, disciplined her, shamed her. The blow with which the husband injured his wife, the blow that struck her face, her skin, her head, her assumptions. The blow that wasn't the first and won't have been the last blow. The blow that broke down their relationship before their relationship broke down. The blow that destroyed what Jean Améry once called trust in the world. Her trust that she was safe from attack. The blow that inflicted violence on a loved one, the blow that struck the woman while the baby was in the same room, that blow changed. From an act of violence, from an act the men performed, into something that somehow allegedly performed him. The blow whose trace I could see in the women's face has now retroactively not injured the woman. Now the blow is apparently a blow that struck him, the man, not her, whom he struck, humiliated him, not her. The blow she suffered is now not his, did not come from him, but from the circumstances, from something he can't control, something beyond him, who is now concerned mainly with himself, not with her, his wife, whom he struck in the face. So that now she doesn't want the blow which struck her to be talked about. The blow was no longer the blow. The blow was the not talking about the blow. She doesn't say that, not at first in any case. She only shakes her head. Tears are running down her face over the red patch that she can't shake off. She doesn't say that, not at first in any case. She only shakes her head. The blow occurred in the other room. We had been invited to dinner. My friend, whom I will call Nadia, had invited me, along with two men I didn't know, to her and her husband's beautiful home. The food was delicious, and we were glad to be there. But we were still on the starters when little digs appeared. Nadia's husband aimed barbs at her, at which she had cooked. Jibes half restrained by social convention and our presence. Or maybe our presence heightened his pleasure in sneering at her. Maybe we were the audience without which there would not have been a point in sneering at her. Maybe the pose of power needs an arena in which to exhibit itself. Little malicious violations. Maybe I should have said something right away. Maybe I should have expressed my discomfort instead of going along with Nadia's and the other at the table, reinterpreting his disgusting behavior as amusing by our strained laughter. Whose strain was I trying to relieve? I had already abandoned her. I was tolerating the way he was demeaning her. Why do we do that? Why aren't we able to stop it right away? Why do we suppress our current or correct intuitive urge to name what we perceive as unacceptable or inappropriate? What mechanisms keep us quiet? What social forms, what timidity makes us make the wrong choice? I suspect that we restrain ourselves in situations like these because we don't want to cause a fuss, don't want to interrupt the pleasant progress of a nice evening. And yet, at that point, the evening wasn't nice anymore. For the sake of pleasantness, we tolerate unpleasant humiliations. For some reason, the burden is always shifted. The person who feels miserable or ill-mannered is the person who refuses to tolerate transgressions. The person who feels awkward is the one who speaks up about inappropriate behavior. How does that work? Why are the hostile little barbs always pronounced in an ironic or casual tone, the deprecations of Nadia still consistent with what is called a lovely, relaxing evening? Why would an objection to those jibes have been perceived as an inappropriate disruption? Or would it not have been perceived as inappropriate? Is that perhaps just what we've been taught for generations? Not to cause a fuss, to endure being demeaned, to tolerate and compensate for the moods, the abusive behavior of others, to indulge them and avoid conflicts? Or is it because an objection would have demeaned Nadia further? Was I waiting for her to defend herself? Would my speaking up have embarrassed her further by signaling that she needed someone to speak for her? Or is that just a clever excuse for cowardice? We were sitting at the table. Nadia had gone into the next room to check on her husband and the baby. As best as I can recall, the baby had cried and he had left the table to go comfort it. When he stayed away for a while, Nadia went to check on them and was gone for a surprisingly long moment. We talked, tried to fill the gap until one of our hosts would reappear. It was slightly embarrassing. We didn't know each other and were suddenly sitting here alone without the people who had invited us. One of the other guests later said he had heard the blow. I hadn't. I only saw Nadia when she came back. She sat down in the same seat as before, played the role of the hostess as before, went on talking as before. She wanted to continue the evening, to pick up at the point where she had stood up and left the room. The interim, the time she had been in the next room, the time during which she had been struck by her lover, her husband, the father of her child, that interim was to be cut out and discarded. She wanted what had happened not to have happened. She didn't want to talk about it, as if talking only would make it real, as if it would no longer be possible to deny it once it had been pronounced. She sat there, a smart, modern woman and a friend, with the tears running down her face. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to serve the next course. She didn't want to interrupt the program, didn't want to deviate from how she had imagined this evening, although the evening was no longer what we had imagined an evening could be. Wasn't this something that couldn't happen anymore in our generation? Weren't we young, self-assured, sophisticated, everything we had thought would guard us against having to respond to domestic violence? Then Nadia and I went into the kitchen for a moment with the others, while the others stayed sitting at the table. In the kitchen, we could talk. The kitchen as a safe space. Cliché. Only now do I notice how funny it is. The gay couple alone at the table, the wife beating husband gone missing, and the two women in the kitchen. Preparing the next course as an opportunity to talk between the familiar hand gestures, talking about the other person's hand. That's not why I became queer. I offered to do what seemed to me the best I could do, to take her and the baby home with me immediately, to put her up at my place, to go with her to see a lawyer, anything but stay there. Anything but pretend nothing had happened. Anything but pretend it was all right, because it was not all right. Anything but gloss over with civilities what could not be glossed over. All she wanted was for us to stay, not to leave, just to have dinner together and talk, as if nothing had happened. We stayed, against our better judgment. What else could we do? We sat there across from each other and talked. I can't remember about what, something that could have been anything but what we wanted to talk about, the blow. We sat there and played, out of love for our friend, a farce that was not funny. We sat there and hoped minute by minute for an ending. All we wanted was to get out of there. Everything was wrong. Her husband did not reappear, by the way. He stayed in the baby's room. At last, it was over. I remember the moment when we, the guests, were standing outside the door in the street and didn't know which way to go. We had left her there. That was what she wanted. We had been discharged into the night, ashamed of our role of having been witnesses and not intervened. Having been witnesses and unable to act, accomplices to something we had never wanted to experience or tolerate, domestic violence. Nadia went on living with her husband for years before they separated. I was no longer close to her during that time. I couldn't do that. Face her husband as if nothing had happened. Look on as a friend while Nadia continued to be mistreated, while she couldn't find her way out of that relationship, while she looked for reasons why her husband was violent, or why he allegedly wasn't violent, why he just hit her sometimes. Why there are reasons after reasons after reasons. In the attempt to rationalize their partner's violence, women or men produce mountains of reasons, yet they can never begin to fill the abyss of the irrational violence. I'm ashamed of not having stood by Nadia, and yet I suspect it saved me from the greater shame I would have felt if I had stood by her and had to look on. A good friend I was not. A good friend would have stayed, no matter how miserable she felt. Maybe. Maybe not. I tried to persuade myself that my refusal to see the violence as normal may have helped her in the end to see the violence as not normal. Maybe. Maybe there is no right in stories like this one. Maybe that's exactly what the violence accomplishes. It harms everyone, maims everyone, plunges everyone into a darkness that has no end until we exit the sphere of violence and run away. Maybe not even then. Those who have been in it recognize its approaching shadow. Those who have been in it evade not only violence, but also the microscopic hints that precede it. Those who have been in it can't stand hearing it glossed over, trivialized, whitewashed, justified, denied, repressed, infused with alleged reasons or good intentions. At the time, I could only think of two possible reactions. Take Nadia with me, or leave her there as she asked me to do. Just to go into the room where her husband was hiding and speak to him, to confront him without mincing words. It's not that I was afraid of it. I didn't even think of it. The second part I'm going to present is, as you will see, different. And it's addressing the questions of desire and shame. Now, I have no fucking clue how you translate this, but I'm in full admiration already for what is going to come. I say that because it's about a particular term with which anti-feminists in Germany blame feminists. And so it's something very particular in German, and as I said, whatever you come up with is going to be fantastic. The German term is, for those of you who might be curious, is Tugendterror. The English translation is already a bit of a stretch. It's puritanical witch hunt. So whatever he's just offered is that. Puritanical witch hunt. At first I thought they got something backwards, or else the phrase had been cut out of a different article, was lurking in some clipboard and ended up in the wrong text, the wrong context. It happens. Words get kidnapped, get used against their will, against their sense. They get abducted, unseen, unheard, and then suddenly they turn up somewhere else. Whoops. Puritanical witch hunt. How on earth is the term puritanical witch hunt related to descriptions of sexual harassment and assault? Why are feminist positions regularly accused of being a witch hunt, being puritanical, being rigorist? What do witches have to do with anything? Or Puritans, for that matter? Seriously, a woman or man or trans person describes how they were molested, harassed, abused, and the answer to that is puritanical witch hunt? What Puritan is hunting what witch? A person tells of an encounter, an experience, in which someone pressured them, harassed them, upset them, and that spreads an atmosphere of witch hunt, of terror in whom? The people who talk about puritanical witch hunt are those who are bothered by the feminist public discourse, those who want to see the field of pleasure, of sexuality, the field of their pleasure and their sexuality, as a kind of unmentionable zone, as if their gestures and actions were above criticism, as if what gives them pleasure must be held unquestionable, untouchable. And at the same time, those who talk about a puritanical witch hunt can take pleasure in anything. They can be amused by whatever they find amusing, they can lust for whatever they want to lust for, but they cannot choose what pleases or arouses others. Strangely, in this discourse of these anti-feminists, pleasure is supposed to be always pleasure, even if it is unpleasant to a given person. Pleasure is supposed to be always pleasure, even when it is all on one side. Pleasure is allegedly always wordless, unconditional, and above doubt, as if there was anything that takes place between two people that is wordless, unconditional, and above all doubt. That is perhaps the most interesting aspect of this witch hunt reflects, that the critics claim to be easygoing and relaxed, that they pretend to be castigating feminists for being uptight, anti-pleasure, and puritanical, while they primarily want to protect themselves, to castigate themselves, to repress themselves into an attitude which they claim is healthy and free in regard to their own sexuality, but which mainly maintains a taboo against talking about it. Those who cry puritanical are trying to prevent a conversation about what gives them pleasure by claiming that the other side is trying to combat pleasure and sexuality. Those who cry witch hunt don't want to accept that there can be pleasurable touching and less pleasurable touching. Someone merely says, what you're saying or doing, what you call pleasurable, to you gives me no enjoyment, makes me afraid, shames me, humiliates me, hurts me. Someone merely says what she or he doesn't want. That has nothing to do with Puritanism. It has to do with autonomy. Maybe the part about wanting needs to be explained again. Not wanting something specific from a certain person does not mean never wanting anything. Saying no to a certain person or certain act, gesture, or practice does not mean there could not be a broad range of acts, gestures, practices that we would want, desire, say yes to with another person, or even with the same person. A no only delineates what the speaker doesn't want in order possibly to open up spaces for what they do want, what gives them pleasure. A no excludes something, but it only draws a boundary that must not be crossed. This side of the boundary is open, free for fantasies, for experiments, for the pleasure of discovery and invention. Together, searching, testing, uncertain and attentive, playful or passionate, with dildos or plugs, anonymous or familiar, hasty and hurried or slow and hesitant, with precise signals as in SM practices, no matter how different the touches and movements may be that give pleasure to one person or the other, always concerned with mutual pleasure, with consent to the mutual experiences that are possible, with a yes that's unambiguously yes, and from which it is possible to create, experiment, develop, experience something that we call desire. Yes is only the beginning. Everything that comes after it, the yes and, is undefined, is dependent once more on what each person wants. That's what's enchanting, alive, exciting. That's where it is. The pleasure coupled with curiosity, with unknowing. That's it. The pleasure that searches for common language of the bodies, the gestures, and the words. That pleasure can be explosive or radical or slow or fast or wild or tender or strong, but it only arises from consent, from the yes and. Puritanical witch hunt? Why would it not be interesting to learn and hear what does or doesn't give pleasure to others? Why wouldn't it be helpful to ask about it? Do I understand the perplexity that can result from that? Yes, absolutely. It is unsettling not to know whether another person understands one's gestures or words and the way we intended them. Of course, this is unsettling, rough terrain. On every hand lurks the danger of striking the wrong tone, of being too quick or too late or too loud or too soft or too clumsy or too self-assured. And yet, taking pleasure in the other person's pleasure is indispensable. Enjoying uncertainty, discovery, talking to each other in all the erotic languages available is what it's about. That's just the exact opposite of puritanical witch hunt. Me Too is not about combating sexuality. It's about taking pleasure in sexuality. Abuse and assault are not sexuality. They are abuse and assault. Those who complain of a puritanical witch hunt or a war on sex are trying to shift the shame. They are trying to ridicule as ashamed those who feel not shame, but anger or grief or the desire for something different. That is too often forgotten, that the experience of humiliation and contempt not only makes people angry, but also demoralizes them. Women who defend themselves are readily accused of rage without recognizing how deeply they are afflicted with grief and melancholia. That is why it is so important to tear down the shame and take back pleasure. No one should be ashamed who has been abused or raped. No one who has been exploited and harassed, no one who has been able to defend herself or himself, who has been paralyzed with fear, able only to whimper or weep or keep silent, should feel ashamed. No one should feel ashamed who has suffered violence, been accosted, shouted at, struck, demeaned. No one of those should be ashamed. No one who lacked the courage to go straight to the police should be ashamed. No one should be ashamed of not having escaped more quickly or more radically from the sphere of violence or abused power. No one should be ashamed of having been unable to translate their shock immediately into fitting words, or having been unable to tell the story of a brutal rape in a perfect linear form, as if it was their most recent shopping list. No one who repulses even minor annoyances should be ashamed. No one should be ashamed who protects against an unwanted hand on their body. No one who wants to decide for themselves when and where and with whom they want to sleep together should be ashamed. No one should be ashamed of having trusted a person or a situation that turned out to be dangerous. No one should be ashamed of someone else's behavior. No one should be ashamed by another person's objectifying gaze. No one should be ashamed of their own pleasure, their own joy, their own clothes. No one should be accused of having allegedly wanted, allegedly provoked something they did not want. No one should be ashamed of their own body, their own desire, expressing their own conception of gender and sexuality, no matter whether that physicality, that sexuality, that expression of gender conforms to any tradition or norm. Most bodies, most practices don't conform to any norm. Deviation from the norm is much more widespread than the norm pretends. Everyone should be able to discover and develop their own pleasure in a language of their own, with their own body and with the bodies and the pleasures of others. And no one should be ashamed of their own pleasure as long as it includes the other person's pleasure, as long as the other person is an adult in a position to choose for themselves. Everything is allowed that is arousing and pleasing. Could I have now the screen? Do we have that in catalán también, o en español, o en algún otro idioma? So the last part is on Undivable Resistance. Those who want to restrict freedom are not hiding their agenda. Those who recognize only a repressive concept of equality are organizing. They are mobilizing under various names and titles. They are radicalizing in Hungary and in Brazil, in Russia and in Spain, in Italy and in Saudi Arabia, in the United States and in Germany. Their anti-modern, obscurantist ambitions are undisguised. They want to support only some women, foster only some families, recognize only certain concept of a nation, only a certain religion. They discredit anything else as unnatural, foreign, unhealthy, as elitist, or as cosmopolitan. Some claim to be evangelical, some Catholic, some Islamist, some Russian Orthodox. They appeal to a certain used to be, like Vox, a time when the nation is supposed to have been imperial or homogeneous or God-fearing, before so much fuss was made about the separation of powers, before the Geneva Convention were in force, before torturers were shamed, a time when the junta was still in power, or the Tsar, or whatever undisputed, undemocratic authority, almost always masculine, by the way, an imaginary time when the traditional family was seen as a Christian or Islamic, or somehow natural constant and not as a product of history. They tell different stories, have different historical references, but they all have in common their recourse to the authoritarian attitude that scorns civil rights and women's rights. They have in common their homophobia and transphobia, their racism, construing the other to suit the society in question. They have in common their contempt for science, their ruthlessness, their mercilessness, their unwillingness to forgive, and they very often have in common a will to destroy. In that light, there are no minor issues, no trivial issues, no elitist issues. For some women, for some men, for some trans persons in many countries in the world, for those who love differently, live differently, the issue is bare survival, saving their bare bodies from torture, imprisonment, mutilation, or lynching. For others, who are spared the worst, for all of us, the issue is the survival of freedom. That is why feminist issues are not luxury issues. The discussion of abused and sexualized violence, the criticism of structures of exploitation, of chauvinistic, homophobic, and transphobic practices and beliefs, this is not a secondary, subordinate discussion to be taken up after the primary, the important, the real problems have been addressed and solved. Those of the workers, those of the unemployed, those of the people who have been socially marginalized. The logic of principal concerns that must be taken seriously and secondary concerns that can be postponed, belittled, and put aside is contemptuous because it sets up a hierarchy of pain. These people's pain is supposed to be more important than those people's pain? Oh, right. And the other people's pain, the secondary, the not so urgent, negligible pain, just always happens to be the black, the gay, the female, the Jewish, the Muslim, the migrant's pain. That has to stop. There is no hierarchy of oppression. The American poet and civil rights activist Audre Lorde once wrote, "There is no priority that dictates whose human rights and whose civil rights need to be enforced first. There is not the social need of the majority on one hand and the cultural need of the minority on the other. Not to mention how amusing it is to see women counted as minority. Respect is not something you have to be able to afford. Respect is not something that can be postponed. Respect is due, always. Issues of recognition are social issues and redistribution issues, and vice versa. It is false to pretend people could be divided in this way. It is wrong to pretend that there were no Moroccan, Algerian women factory workers, or gay Muslims, or Jewish pensionaries, or it is false to simplify the diverse, overlapping, mutually attenuating or amplifying experiences of belonging and not belonging, just to resist the accompanying demands. The discussion of abuse and sexualized violence, the debates on equal pay and equal representation, the issues of gender discrimination, quotas for women, and the concepts and images in which people think and talk about bodies and sexuality, the social, aesthetic, economic, political conditions which help to reproduce the disparagement of certain forms of life, all of this is urgent. And it does not prevent us from reflecting on liberty and equality in other respects. I can criticize ruthless housing policy and sexist language. I can protest exploitative working conditions in factories and free trade zones and advocate the introduction of unisex toilets. I can demand higher inheritance taxes and defend Muslim women's autonomy. I can want a European unemployment benefit and sustainable climate protection. I can also demand spaces for promiscuous sex practices, by the way, and at the same time approve of religious education in public schools, just to make the confusion complete. I can link social and cultural issues, political and economic issues, ecological and religious issues, just as I can think of local issues in connection with global issues. The polarities are false. They are aimed at disrupting the public discourse. We mustn't allow ourselves to play it against one another. We mustn't be fooled into dividing ourselves into our white part and our gay part, or our migrant part and our atheist part, or our black part and our middle class part. We must not deny our complexity, our individuality, just to fit into false monochromatic categories. These are issues of freedom and justice, social and political issues, issues of the so-called majority and the so-called minorities. They concern everyone in a democratic society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolin, for this wonderful intervention. Obrim una estona per les vostres preguntes, comentaris. No sé si algú té ganes.
So we're going to open for a Q&A. I don't know if you are... Well, that was a thought-provoking presentation on silence, on violences in plural, because there are many forms of violence. So now the floor is yours. Who is breaking the ice here? No one? Then I'll start. Carolin, if you agree. So while listening to you, I was thinking, wow, this reflection which is quite a mainstream reflection, the body understood as the battlefield of our times. To what extent this battle, let's say, has been enlarged, expanded? To what extent today the body is today more of a battlefield than in previous times? To what extent this or our bodies have, let's say, gained importance, or has it always been the case?
Puedes contestar en inglés, ¿eh?
Bueno, comienzo en inglés y tal vez cambio en castellano. No, I mean, I think there's dissimultaneities. I mean, there are ways in which the bodies of many, many, many people are still disciplined, formed, beaten, raped, mutilated, just the way they have been, a long time ago. So I think there's always contexts where there's not just feminisms in plural, there isn't even feminism in singular. And yet, at the same time, evidently, I would say, I think if each of us would think about our own families, we could probably see that the understanding of the body of my grandmother, my mother, and I, independent of me now being gay, queer, is completely different. The understanding of intimacy is different. The understanding of what can be said and not said, the sheer understanding of there being a female subjectivity of desire is something, I mean, sort of an active desire is something that I think has really changed. I mean, really changed, and yet it is, it is still, and as I would say, particularly now with, a radical right movement that's a global phenomenon that, is anti-feminist at its core. This is not just a minor ideological aspect of these movements. This is core of their ideological setting, and sadly enough, it is that, so the battleground of about female bodies, about traditional families, all these questions. It's sadly enough also that segment of the ideology of the extreme right that they use as an instrument to infiltrate the center of society, because they think, you know, with racism or anti-Semitism, depending on the context, that may be still a little bit difficult to mobilize. Yet with anti-feminism, they think they can really mobilize, not just in the periphery of, you know, the right extreme, but in the center of the political discourse. So in that sense, I would say at the historic moment that we're living at the moment, we do see, you know, movements like Ni Una Menos, the Me Too movement, and so we are optimistic. We see very, very strong, you know, social movements resisting this backlash. But I'm pretty haunted by this, you know, by this global phenomenon of a radical right having that anti-modernist, authoritarian, anti-feminist core.
Em perdo, és que no veig allà darrere i després aquí davant.
He oído por primera vez.
So, for the first time, I heard that women are not a minor topic. I've heard for the first time this afternoon, thank you very much for saying that feminism or women are not a secondary topic like black or Muslims. I never thought about that this way. And we're not a minority, and we represent 51% of the population. All of a sudden, I recall all the murders of women in our country. And these murders are never compared with terrorism, assassinations, ETA, the terrorist group in the Basque country. And we never speak about women who are murdered. So thank you very much for telling me, for saying that women are not a minority, because it is empowering as a concept. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
I have to apologize that I don't speak Spanish. I gave interviews in Spanish all day long. I was criticizing the king in Spanish, so forgive me for, my Spanish has deteriorated now, so if I may, can I speak in English? Yes, I think it's key. I mean, one has to say, oh, I mean, women are not a minority. And I think what's interesting is there's different ways of marginalizing groups. One way is to exclude them, to discriminate them, to stigmatize them, and to do so publicly, and then if people from these groups react, quite often one tries to give reasons why they're being discriminated or excluded, as if there were justification for it. There's another way of marginalizing, and that is denying that marginalization exists. And I think that is, I think, also the difference that you were hinting at. I think there is a recognition that we're confronted with racism. There is a recognition that we are confronted with Islamophobia. But very often there's not that much recognition of there being really still patriarchic structures, and there's still, you know, discrimination and exclusion of women. So I think part of the difficulty of you know, feminist discourse is, first of all, to explain that there's a need for it. And it may seem totally absurd, but I think this is what, I'll give you an example. You may have heard there was a terrorist attack in Germany 2 weeks ago in the city of Halle. I don't know if that was reported. There was a right-extreme terrorist who tried to enter a synagogue on Yom Kippur and tried to kill as many Jews as possible. Now, thank God he did not manage to get into the synagogue. He did not manage to open the door. I have to say, he was a bit of an idiot, so, you know, thank God he was an idiot. But he shot 2 people. When he couldn't enter the synagogue, he decided, oh, you know, Jews would have been great, but if I can't shoot Jews, I would just try to get some tax. So he moved away from the synagogue, and a woman who was just passing by heard the noise and just said, she didn't understand the situation. She didn't know that this guy was trying to kill people. So she just said, you know, does that have to be today? Or something like this, just because she was annoyed about the noise. And he immediately shot her. And he walked towards the body and shot her another 3 times, really executed her. And then he drove up to doner kebab shop, hoping to kill as many migrants as he could kill. Now, here's why I'm telling the story. I'm telling the story because we know from his self-explanations that he was streaming online while killing people. We know about his ideology. And not surprising to me, the ideology is deeply anti-feminist. He hates women. And, you know, in his rant, he complains about feminists being guilty of the demographics in Germany and feminists being guilty for the mass migration. Now, in the coverage in the news media afterwards, there was a main concern with him potentially entering a synagogue. Now, evidently, in Germany, that makes sense. Evidently, in Germany, with the history of the Shoah, there's a particular sensitivity towards anti-Semitism, and it would have been a nightmare had he been able to enter a synagogue. And yet, that doesn't explain why the fact that this guy had a deep anti-feminist hatred was almost forgotten. Like 24 hours later, nobody was talking about that anymore. So I'm only saying this to reaffirm that there is a bizarre hierarchy of suffering. There's a bizarre hierarchy in representing the pain of some and not the pain of others. And I think what this series here at the CCCB makes so important, even or maybe in particular in these trying times, is you know, to spend a whole series and to have a huge exhibition and invite guests to speak about feminism, because it's not a luxury secondary concern.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer to your first very vivid storytelling situation and refer to violence and silence, and would be happy to hear your view on how does it come that most of us stay silent when we witnessed violence very, very close to us, when we witness injustice, and for which reasons do we accept situations that are not acceptable? I mean, you tried to give us some explanation on that, but it's not only violence against women. We daily face a violent situation, and we all have difficulties in speaking up when violence is obvious, when injustice is obvious. And my imagination is that cultural contexts, social contexts, make us shut our mouths and accept persons and groups who speak up, and that we should not tolerate. And so I would be, or may I speak for other peoples, I think, glad to hear what we all ourselves could do in our very personal surroundings in having more courage in facing those situations.
Maybe I can start answering the question by asking who of you would have been able to go to the room next door to the husband? You would have? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Well, for me, it was, I hope that if something like this would happen to me again, that I would be better. And I think for me it was important to speak about these examples because I wanted to not sound too knowledgeable, or I wanted to include examples of my own ambiguity or my own incompetence or my being insecure about what is the right thing to do. And I think it's key for the feminist discourse, as for any liberation movement, that we do include those moments and those aspects and those effects of doubt, of failure, or because along these situations I think we can analyze what needs to be done, or we can analyze the structures and the ideologies that penetrate us to such an extent that we are unable to react. And so that brings me to the question, and I do think the first question was, what is it that incapacitates us so much? And I would say, that's power. That's exactly how power works. As long as we think of power and domination only sort of in vertical relationships, we're not going to grasp this. We really have to understand how ideology works, how we're permanently, the whole formation of us as a subject is filled and only possible with and through, ideologies about domination, ideologies about male, masculinity and femininity, about heteronormativity. So we grew up with this. Of course I was brought up that way, to not make a fuss, to just be helpful, to just be altruistic, of course. I'm born in the year 67. That is part of what the expectation was of what a daughter should be like. Now, evidently, didn't work out the way my family imagined that. But so I think unless we really look for the way we are subjugated by these ideologies and these power structures, we're not going to change them. And I think there's also something that doesn't have to do with, do you want some water? There's somebody coughing all the time. No, en serio. Toma un poco. Te va a ayudar. But then there's something else. And I think we also that has nothing to do with the particularities of sort of the formation into female or male, binary, but it has to do with what violence is. And that is, I think, very often overlooked and something I particularly worked on and wrote about as long as I was working as a war reporter in areas of crisis. And that is that violence and abuse are a cognitive shock, not just a moral shock. It is something that is extremely difficult to accept that it has happened. There is a state of disbelief. I don't know if you read Primo Levi's description of Auschwitz. And when Primo Levi was sent to concentration camp, he arrived in the lager, and the first days, he was just confused. He was just totally, it wasn't that he was upset, he was confused. And he had an elder inmate, an Hungarian inmate by the name of Steinlauf, I think, who told him, now if everybody starts coughing, I don't have enough water, but there's one more. And he says, so the elder inmate tells the young one, do not try to understand. You know, you will not survive if you try to understand this. And I know this also from war zones, is if you're confronted with grave, grave atrocities, your mind is limping behind. You know, the moment I was outside the door of that evening, I immediately knew what I could have done. That was the problem that she didn't want to, but still, you know, I think an hour later was much, much clearer. But in the moment, I think we were all just shocked. And that is, I think, what I'm trying to do with my work and with my writing. And I think what is also, again, really important about the work of the... I have to say I'm a real aficionado del CCCB. Me encanta el trabajo que está haciendo Judith y todo ese equipo. Me parece que es uno de los lugares más importantes en Europa. Realmente, realmente muy importante. Entonces, ese discurso del feminismo es muy importante porque cambia también la forma de imaginar y se debe imaginar violencia. Si no lo imaginamos, no vamos a creer las mujeres. Entonces, we need to change perceptions. We need to speak about domestic violence. We need to speak about sexual violence. Because if we don't speak about it, we always will consider it incredible. And we have to believe it. If we don't believe it, we abandon the women and men and boys who suffer it. So I think when you ask me, how do we change, how do we make sure that we are able to criticize something? I think what it requires is, first of all, to actually really believe and understand what you're seeing. And in order to do that, we need to, speak about it, explain it, and yeah, sorry. ¿Tenemos otro vaso? Tal vez un poco, una cerveza sin vaso. ¿Qué? ¿Una cerveza de plástico? No bebo, sí, pero no bebo cerveza en algo plástico.
Alguna altra qüestió? Aquí darrere. Després la Bettina.
Yeah, well, the only thing I wanted to say is that to talk about this violence is not enough.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
The only thing I wanted to say is that to talk about this violence is not enough to solve the problem. I mean,
No, of course not.
Okay. I just wanted to...
No, it's not, no, of course not. No, you need, I mean, to really combat the violence, you need all kinds of instruments, all kinds of techniques. You need, social institutions, you need laws, you need, all kinds of different practices. What I was just saying was referring to that particular situation and why one is unable to actually really react, and them saying, or at least from my perspective, why I was so slow. I think it was just in a state of shock.
Yeah, but in the case of the refugees or some migrants that die in the Mediterranean Sea, so we all have images of that, but we don't react. Obviously we react, but in a very different way to personal violence.
Oh.
So, we all know that, and we talk about that, and we all believe that, but this is not creating or starting a big movement to change that.
No, sure, but that's not what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I know.
No, evidently. Evidently it depends on what kind of violence are we talking about. Are we talking about domestic, a case of domestic violence that you witness? Are we talking about, racist collective attack of a refugee shelter or the lynching of a person? It very, very much depends on what kind of violence are we talking about. Is it individual? Is it collective? Is it institutional? Is it by the police? And so, of course, there's all kinds of different needs for preventing it, or then in the situation of where it's happened, of trying to act. But then, I think there's no, I would say there's no mechanism in which I could now respond to that that is so general that it makes sense, but it has to, we have to then look at what specific kind of acts of violence are we talking about, or what kind of structural violence are we talking about.
Me gustó mucho lo que dijiste al final de la charla sobre el hecho de que luchar por una causa no excluye luchar por muchas otras causas progresistas. Lo que yo veo actualmente es, sin embargo, un poco una balcanización, se podría decir, de diferentes grupos de acción, porque ahora voy a polemizar un poco lo que Sigmund Freud llamó el narcisismo de las pequeñas diferencias. Es algo que yo me temo que actualmente está atomizando un poco ciertas luchas. Y me gustaría saber cómo verdaderamente se consigue ese salto de unirse y decir, bueno, es una sola causa y que tiene muchas diferentes expresiones, porque hay también científicos que dicen actualmente que las luchas por las diferentes identidades muchas veces han dejado de lado los intereses comunes.
Yo no lo veo así.
¿Cómo se puede volver
Sí.
a un cierto universalismo de los derechos humanos,
Sí.
teniendo en cuenta el derecho a la diversidad?
Sí, pero yo no lo veo así. Yo no veo que hay una fragmentación de la oposición contra, bueno, digamos, ahora la violencia de la derecha, me imagino que están hablando. No, I didn't see it. At least I see, very different social movements uniting, and very, very, very different groups of joining together. There is a huge movement in Germany that's trying to oppose racism, violence against migrants, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, and that's called Unteilbar, Indivisibles. And so the idea of the entire movement is that one cannot divide them, that one cannot accept what I think the international global extreme right tries to do. Is they always try to instrumentalize. I mean, sometimes they claim feminist causes when it's against Muslims. Sometimes they pretend to be, defending LGBTIQ rights when it's against Muslims. So it's, you know, it's a very manipulative discourse, and I think it's key and crucial to see the movements, you know, that are trying to defend human rights, that are trying to resist, you know, racism and Islamophobia and, you know, LGBTIQ phobia, that they unite. And at least in the last 2 years in Germany, that's what we have seen. We have seen a real, you know, a united struggle among these different groups to resist this. So in that sense, if I look at the opposition to violence, if I look at the opposition to you know, the neo-nationalistic authoritarian right, I'm optimistic. What, you don't share my optimism?
No, precisamente, bueno, hablando de optimismo...
No,
sí,
no.
Sí, sí. No,
No digo que ganamos, pero por lo menos lo existe como oposición, lo que existe como movimiento social contra el racismo es realmente, bueno, unido.
No, lo ligaba con una conversación que hemos tenido antes, ¿no? En la que explicabas que no estás viajando tanto, ¿no? Como en zonas de conflicto como antes, porque tienes la sensación que en estos momentos el conflicto está en el corazón de Europa, ¿no? Sí. A mí me gustaría, si no hay ninguna pregunta más, acabar preguntándote por cómo ves esta Europa 30 años después de la caída del muro de Berlín, ¿no? que es, bueno, era un momento de un cierto optimismo, recuperando, ¿no? ¿Cómo ves esta Europa, ¿no? Recuperando esta idea de...
Actually, it's, I think maybe the perception... Oh God, I'm getting myself into real trouble now. Let's put it this way. I think the fall of the wall was a very utopian, you know, liberating moment because it was the fall of the wall, because it was the end of a totalitarian state. And so I think we all cheered that, you know. Yet, at the same time, one has to say, for many minorities, for many migrants, many German migrants, that was already, you know, a moment of concern. It was already a moment of worry. It was the reintegration, the normalization of a nationalism that was allegedly not aggressive, that was allegedly not racist. I think it culminated in the World Cup in 2006, when, you know, there were all these celebrations of the World Cup, and I think there was a certain political discourse that was extremely celebratory about this image of another German society, of, you know, an image of, you know, a peaceful, multicultural, you know, sometimes they make even jokes, the Germans. I mean, it was a sort of a different kind of celebration of a nationalism that was allegedly innocent. And yet, at the same time, for many of us, including myself, it was difficult. It was a normalization of a sentiment that I had been brought up with to fear. And so for me, it's not that there was this one historic moment and everyone was optimistic and now suddenly we see, you know, a Europe that is divided, that is not sure about how liberal, how modern, how enlightened, how pluralistic it wants to be. Suddenly we are in a Europe where we have these movements with a dogma of purity. So I would say I was already concerned at that moment, not because I didn't think it was a liberation, of course that was a liberation, not because I was naive about the totalitarian repressive nature of that regime. But, I mean, very early in the 90s, we saw racist attacks on refugee shelters in the East and the West. Wasn't just an East phenomenon, but sort of the emergence of racist violence is not something that we just see now. And I think there is a desire, I don't know how that is in Spain, but I think there's always a desire to perceive each violent attack against migrants or against a woman as an individual case, as something exceptional. And I think that is also, an attempt, a narrative. Instead of saying, no, there are continuities, and we see these continuities, and what has changed in Europe, I would say maybe is just the social taboos are not functioning anymore. There is an exhibitionism of hatred. People are proud of their racism. They're not ashamed at all. And so I would say the quality of the hatred has changed, but not necessarily the quantity. Sorry, it's less optimistic than you thought.
Em sap greu. Bueno, muchísimas
Thank you very much, Carolin.
por haber vuelto a Barcelona, por haber vuelto al CCB. Mañana seguiremos en una sessió más pequeño formato. Moltíssimes gràcies a tots vosaltres per acompanyar-nos un dia més. Seguim demà amb més poesia. Gràcies.